If you've seen Gladiator II or have been paying attention to the film as it has been released, you will have seen a lot of criticism that the film is not historically accurate. The director Ridley Scott is known for directing these historical epics, however, this isn't the first time he has been criticised for the lack of historical accuracy in his movies. Films like Kingdom of Heaven and even the first Gladiator movie have their own inconsistencies with the historical fact, and Napoleon, Ridley Scott's most recent film before Gladiator II, has been heavily criticised for the historical inaccuracy. Whilst I understand the argument about the historical inaccuracies, I don't feel this is the most important thing when making a movie. Ridley Scott seems to be focused on directing historical epics and the best visuals and enhancing the drama of the story in a way that seems best to fit the narrative. Looking at the first Gladiator that came out in 2000, many people praise that movie, but it still has its own historical inaccuracies. Maximus Decimus Meridius was never a real historical character. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was played by Richard Harris, was not in fact murdered by his son Commodus. We believe that Aurelius succumbed to the disease the Anatine Plague, which we believe is smallpox. Going on to the fate of Commodus, whilst Commodus was an emperor gladiator and did perform in the Coliseum, he was murdered in his bathtub by one of the Praetorian guards and did not die in combat against this Maximus character in the Coliseum. I also haven't given it too much thought, but Commodus went on to reign for 12 years after the death of Marcus Aurelius, and the time frame between the death of Aurelius in the opening minutes of the film and then the film concluding with Commodus's death, I don't believe felt that it was a 12-year span. The filmmakers and the writers took the liberty of condensing the timeline in order to create a sense of drama, and I feel that works better for the story they're telling. I've spoken about it before, how we as cinema goers see these worlds being created and it looks accurate historically even though it isn't, but we believe it to be because of the iconography of how it's been represented across cinema in the last 100 years. What springs to mind is that there was a scene in the original script of Gladiator where Maximus was going to endorse olive oil, almost like how sportsmen in today's society have endorsements for sports products like trainers or energy drinks, for example. So whilst that is historically accurate, it might be jarring for the cinema audience to see that and feel it takes them right out of the story of the film. Another inaccuracy is the fact that in the film they portray the sparing of the character with the thumbs up sign, and traditionally that was the okay to kill them because that was the idea of having your sword unsheathed, and thumbs down, which is kind of portrayed across cinema is for the character to be killed, was actually the order to have their sword sheathed and they would be spared from execution. Moving on to Gladiator II, one of the big talking points is the fact that they had sharks in the Coliseum when it had been flooded. This has caused a great deal of discussion, and to be honest, I kind of feel like the filmmakers put this in as an attempt to create controversy and get people to see the movie. The scene I'm talking about only lasts a couple of minutes, if that, and doesn't really impact the greater plot and the experience of the film. But I've seen this is one of the biggest talking points when people are discussing the movie online, so it kind of feels like a genius way of garnering attention for the movie. That being said, it is believed that the Colosseum was flooded and there was reenactments of sea battles. This wasn't just done in the Colosseum, but would have been done in amphitheatres across the Roman Empire. It has been pointed out though that the Colosseum did have tunnels and traps built beneath it for future games, and the flooding of the Colosseum probably took place around 100 years or even 150 years before the events of Gladiator II. Though I do believe there is evidence of other arenas, one being built on the River Tiber in Rome, and this is where the sea battles would have taken place. And in regards to the type of animals that were used in this, sharks would have been unlikely, and it's more likely that they would have used crocodiles or hippopotamuses rather than great white sharks, because the idea of transporting a great white shark 2,000 years ago from the middle of the ocean, somehow getting it to the middle of the city of Rome alive and being able to look after it long enough for it to survive and take part in this spectacle is just not possible. But saying that, I feel this adds a bit of spectacle and excitement to the film, and I don't really care that this is in the film. It doesn't take me out of the experience, and it didn't impact my ability to enjoy what the film did. One of the other criticisms is the fact that there was a character riding a rhino in the Coliseum. Whilst there was evidence, I believe, of animals being used in the Coliseum like lions, tigers, possibly rhinos, no one would have been able to tame and ride a rhino. That wouldn't even be possible today, so that is just a bit of spectacle. And Ridley Scott spoke about having that visual in his head from the first film, but they didn't have the ability to do CGI in order to craft that image, so he saved it for this film. But the biggest historical inaccuracy of Gladiator II comes from its timeline. Once again in this film, the timeline of the ruling emperors is condensed in order to have multiple characters who did exist around the same time, but their reigns of ancient Rome were not this close together. Going back to the first film, Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, and the film is said to take place 16 years after that, which would put us in 196 AD. And at that time, the Emperor of Rome was Septimus Severus, who was actually the father of the two antagonist emperors who feature in this film, Caracalla and Geta. Though the title card seemingly says that this film takes place 16 years after the death of Marcus Aurelius, that could be a mistake, and it does take place 16 years after Commodus's death, which was in 192. However, I've pointed out that the events between the death of Aurelius and Commodus were put closer together, and even if it's 16 years after the events of Commodus's death in 192 AD, it still gives us Septimus Severus as emperor, as the emperors Caracalla and Geta don't come into power until 1211 AD. Going into spoilers of the film, so if you haven't seen it, please click off this for now, but Caracalla ends up assassinating his brother Geta in order to be the sole emperor of Rome, and that happened in 211 AD, with Caracalla actually being emperor of Rome for another 6 years until 217 AD. And then the next emperor is actually someone called Macrinus, who is actually played by Denzel Washington in this movie, and he went on to be emperor of Rome for just under a year. But if you've seen the film, it's worth pointing out that the rule of Geta and Caracalla, the assassination of Geta, the death of Caracalla, the rise of Macrinus, and then the death of Macrinus all take place within probably 2 days of each other. So this film is very lenient with the historical fact, however I don't feel that ruins the film in any aspect for me. On a historical note, there was talk that Denzel Washington was actually going to play the character of Septimus Severus, but for whatever reason they backed out of that idea and he was playing Macrinus instead. Having Denzel Washington portray Septimus Severus and have the characters of Geta and Caracalla in this film would have made more sense in the timeline if they set this around 208-209 AD. But obviously the filmmakers are taking a historic liberty and just doing their own thing. I don't feel that this matters too much. I feel like I was even told in history class in secondary school that you shouldn't look at these films that tell historical events as 100% fact. Obviously they pick and choose elements of history and they condense history and they show off the iconography, what we've been shown through Hollywood and television over the last 100 years about the historical period. I feel like there's plenty of room for historians to come in and point out the historical inaccuracies, and that's quite fun to do. However, I don't think that ruins the experience for the film, for me, at all, and a lot of people will probably forgive that. And I've seen, I believe it was Dan Snow, the historian, say that even if there is some fictional elements in telling these historical stories, if a film like this can encourage someone to pick up a history book and get interested in that period, then ultimately that's a good thing. Gladiator II obviously has a lot more historical inaccuracies, and if you're really into that, you can point that out in the comments below. And I've seen other YouTubers go into more detail about the historical inaccuracies, whether or not they can kind of forgive the historical inaccuracy or they feel like it is a complete betrayal of fact, and they're quite fun to watch, so please go seek them out. And I am keen to hear your thoughts on Gladiator II and whether or not you were bothered by the historical inaccuracies, or did you just go along to enjoy the film for what it is. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and please click the bell icon to receive notifications for all of my future videos. That's it for now, thanks for tuning in.